with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Wednesday, August 23rd, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Stephen Bright and James Kwak, authors of The Fear of Too Much Justice, Race, Poverty, and the Persistence of Inequality in the Criminal Courts. And later in the show, Katherine Stewart will be with us to discuss her piece in the New Republic about the Claremont Institute. Meanwhile, the first Republican debate is tonight, sans Trump, but with the Majority Report. Tune into our coverage at 9 p.m.
More than makes up for my absence.
Well, he will be somewhere else doing a pre-recorded interview with Tucker Carlson on X, Twitter, known audio-visual medium. Twitter.
If that doesn't get 5x the views that Vivek got, Trump's going to turn on him.
And by the way, this is Tucker's attempt to get back at Fox, so. John Eastman turned himself in for booking in Georgia yesterday. Giuliani set to meet with that DA's office to discuss his bond today. UPS and the Teamsters officially agreed to their new deal with wage gains for full and part-time workers. Hollywood Studios released the details of their offer to the writers on day 113 of the strike, an attempt to divide members by going around the negotiating committee. Fake progressive Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey vetoes an ordinance guaranteeing minimum wages for Uber and Lyft drivers. The U.S. Department of Labor's internal watchdog is conducting a probe of the DOL's response to the growing number of child labor violations. The conservative freak behind the Supreme Court affirmative action cases, Ed Blum, now suing schools for discriminating against straight white men.
Finally.
A city in
Gotta get
Oregon.
reparations.
I mean, do you feel emancipated now?
I need the reparations.
A city in Oregon asked the Supreme Court to take up a case to determine whether ticketing the homeless outside for sleeping outside is cruel and unusual. And it turns out the eviction moratorium and expanded rent protections during COVID reduced homelessness by 17%.
But at what cost?
None. Literally no cost. Washington, Oregon, Maine, and Alaska declined federal money from Biden to replace their lead pipes. 18 bodies believed to be migrants found near the Turkish border of Greece, where wildfires have been raging. And lastly, China and South Korea express outrage over Japan's decision to release wastewater from Fukushima's nuclear plant into the Pacific. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, 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 everybody. It is Hump Day. I say that with...
It's a big hump day.
It is, because we got to get over this hump. I mean, I'm having a hard time today. I was full disclosure to Bradley and Matt. Whoopsie to my landlord, who still hasn't fixed my air conditioning or the floorboards that are discolored and warped to the point where I can't even open a door to one other part of my apartment because the floorboards are so elevated, okay? So I just had to get that out of my... I'm so close to naming the slumlords that own my apartment complex. I am so close to doing so.
Do a little
And I
investigative
threatened it in
journalism.
the email. And maybe that comes off like a Karen, but I don't think it does because this is about landlords and they're the worst
Yep.
people in the world.
You can Karen at landlords.
So anyway, I'm just a little bit distracted by that, but the show goes on. Honestly, this is like my sanctuary these days, the workplace, because the air conditioning is working here somehow. And
We're a family here.
For now.
yeah, right. What is this? The office? Like the U.S. office where your workplace is family, and the UK office is like
We have fun
actually the
here.
workplace sucks, right?
Yeah.
A little bit more on point, but
I never got to work in an office that size, and I sometimes feel like I missed out, but I want the cubicle experience. Maybe we should get cubicles in here. I'll look over the cubicle. You and Sam.
yeah.
Bradley's looking for the clip. It's gonna be up. It's gonna be right there.
Or we could go the entire other way and like do what the tech bros do in like beanbag chairs everywhere, everywhere. And look completely.
I think the
That makes
culture
another
war. I think
workplace.
Tim Pool's The Culture War was already doing that.
You know, I thought they were beanbag chairs, but when I saw them, they're just those dorm room sloped ones that are kind of spindled out, and then it's like a canvas, but with a little bit of pad. They aren't even fun to sit in, those chairs. But everyone's
She was offered a tour, sushi, and poker with the boys.
I turned that down. Yes, I did. Let's get into it really quick right off the top here. So, this is a clip that I love of demonstrators with climate defiance in not just Massachusetts, but I guess this is in Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket.
Yeah, this is.
Are you sure it's?
I thought it was Nantucket.
It's Nantucket.
Yeah, Nantucket.
Yeah, which makes it Nantucket's snobbier than Martha's Vineyard. I mean,
for real?
let's be. Oh yeah, Nantucket's the Republican version. Martha's Vineyard is a little bit more multicultural, more family oriented.
I only know Nantucket from
I've
funny rhymes. But.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my bad. Yeah, it is Nantucket. Yeah, my
And
fault.
I'm pretty sure there's like a history too of Democratic presidents like Obama and Clinton being on Martha's Vineyard, Republicans being on Nantucket. It's very much this
Interesting, right? Yeah, of
partisan
course.
divide for the wealthy in this country. But so that just adds like an extra flavor to this clip. But these are 10 climate activists at a fundraiser for Governor Maura Healey of Massachusetts at a private Nantucket home. And they're confronting her over the state's continued construction of new fossil fuel projects. And in the midst of this horrific summer of climate emergencies all across the continental U.S., and then, of course, what we're seeing internationally constantly as well, these demonstrations just have a little bit more kick to them as time continues to pass and as we continue to run out of time. Here we go.
Excuse me, Governor Healy, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're in the midst of a climate emergency.
What's your name?
My name is Matt.
Nice to meet you,
I'm
Matt.
20 years old and you're throwing my future. The state of Massachusetts is building 10 new fossil fuel infrastructure projects right now. We need you to ban new fossil fuel infrastructure right now. Will you commit to doing that, yes or no?
Let's talk about that, okay?
Let's talk about it, yes or no?
Let's talk about that. There's a huge transition that we're undergoing, and there's a lot of work to do. But let me tell you, and I
The first step of the
appreciate...
transition is to ban new fossil fuels. Will you ban new fossil fuel infrastructure?
I appreciate that, Matt. Guys, I appreciate it's democracy.
And fossil fuels, Maura! And fossil fuels!
And
fossil fuels, Maura! And fossil fuels!
You insulted us.
How did I assault you? There is no future. Get out! The fossil fuel industry bought you out. The fossil fuel industry gave you $50,000. And fossil fuels, Maura! And fossil fuels!
Longer than marijuana.
Yeah, how's that work?
Fossil fuels! And fossil fuels!
Touch you.
And fossil fuels! Fossil fuels!
You hurt your friend.
We've spoken to her before. She's ignored us.
You have no idea how to get things done. You have no idea how to get things done.
We're afraid because our lives are going to end.
We're all the same age.
No, we're not. I'm 20.
I have kids that are 9.
Okay.
You have absolutely no idea how to get things done.
Can you tell me what are you doing to help them?
In the
Are you doing
I have solar everything. I have solar in my home.
individual
God.
act going to help us? No, the act of someone in power is going
If you had half
to.
a brain, you would understand
We
how
have
to get
no
things
money.
done.
Laura has power, and she can help save us, but
But
she's
your
not.
rudeness prevents you
We're
from
gonna
talking
die.
to her.
Who cares how rude we are?
I don't mind
And
if
the
you
people
die.
in that
I'm
event
gonna die a lot
love
quicker
us.
than you are.
Well, the visuals there are just amazing, right?
I don't mind if you die, actually.
Yeah. Wait, so can you go back and actually play that final 10 seconds? I don't mind if you die.
The guy also says, I'm going to die before you are. It's like, yeah, bro, that's the point.
So apparently, I just want to point out that an article pointed out that that guy is of someone named Bruce Purcell, a Boston real estate tycoon. And after tone policing them says, I don't care if you die. Let's play this final 10 seconds here.
Laura has power, and she can help save us, but she's
your
not.
rudeness prevents you
We're
from
gonna
talking
die.
to her.
Who cares how rude we are?
I don't mind
And
if
the
you
people
die.
in that
I'm gonna
event
die a lot
love
quicker
us.
than you are.
It's your rudeness that prevents me from taking you seriously, but I don't mind if you die.
What's amazing is these people don't understand that you have zero credibility on this. And also you prove it by the point that your response is, I have solar everything. What a great demonstration of what a lot of this stuff is, which is just a way for rich people to do just enough consumption in the right direction that they feel like they've done enough. Bro,
Exactly.
you are, I mean, and so great job for Climate Defiance. The more that you can disrupt these sorts of spaces, and I also love it because there's not a working person being inconvenienced the entire thing.
Yeah.
The more you can go and show that all this stuff, all these like fancy like meetings that people have on their nice lawns, it's all BS. And I mean, how shallow. I have solar everything, bro. Please.
I also just love the guy who looks like one of the twins from Uncut Gems following them, being like, I've been a climate activist for longer than you were alive, and look what it's gotten me. I can wear a summer jacket with my nice sunglasses and for $25,000 watch Maura Healey speak in Nantucket.
Yeah, you get invited to political fundraisers for people. Good job.
Well, no, the $25,000 thing, they're annoyed that their pay-to-play situation is being a bit disrupted, where they just get a little bit of access. People aren't doing that just to hear the incredible words coming out of Maura Healey's mouth. When you have that kind of puncturing of these events, it makes these people feel like maybe deep down some sort of guilt, but at the same time, they're like, no, I paid good money to get access to the governor, and I do not want this to get in my way. And just to your point about the individual consumption element, I really don't care too much if you have solar panels on your house, gotta be honest with you, because that's homeowner privilege. There's a lot of people who don't have the ability, who are renters like myself.
Right, it's all theoretical for me.
Yeah, to put solar panels on my on my apartment complex, that's not going to happen, obviously. This is about government action. So I don't really care what those individuals have done.
And they have no idea about that. They think because they drive an electric car and have solar panels that, hey, don't look at me.
It's a fundamentally neoliberal like belief in what the world how change happens in the world. It's all through individualistic consumption as opposed to government action, because this isn't you showing up to this guy's house and there's not a politician there. It's the governor of one of the biggest states of in the country. That's why they're demonstrating.
It's the consumption politics, like immediately contrasted with what they're doing, which is getting one of these like politicians, who are not responding to the crisis, which is pretty much most of them. But like, yeah, I mean, it's such a glaring contrast. And yeah, that you think you can sort of preach to climate activists who are doing, frankly, as much as I've seen done, that they aren't doing it right and that you know better because of rudeness, bro. Like, more rudeness, please.
Yeah, they've done a great job, Climate Defiance, with disrupting Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo at a few different events, as well as Vice President Harris at another event at a Martha's Vineyard High School.
That was the Martha's Vineyard one.
Yeah, so they've actually, I think, honestly, they've been doing a pretty good job of just standing pat in the Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket area, waiting for these politicians to come through.
If you're a wealthy climate activist, or from like from the background where you can access these sorts of neighborhoods too, like political campaign season and this sort of thing, you know what? You know there's infrastructure to make your stuff go viral. So go work with a group like Climate Defiance and get out there.
And just to reiterate kind of what we were saying before, do not fall into the trap of thinking that climate activism is about your individual consumption. It's totally fine to make those choices. And if you're vegan, to not shop from someplace like Amazon, I am all for that decision. But when you make that the focus of climate activism, it is counter-revolutionary, because that is never going to solve the climate crisis. The reason that a fundraiser with a politician is being targeted is because there needs to be disruption and an end to the new production of fossil fuels, whether it be through the construction of new projects with fossil fuels or pipelines or just the usage. That is about targeting a collective government response. So do not fall for individual consumption as a method for actual change, because that will always leave you wanting, and it will always leave the planet burning. All right, guys, gonna take a quick break, a word from our sponsor, and then we will be back with Stephen Bright and James Kwak.
Thank you, Emma. Today's sponsor, one of Emma's favorites. Think about the most refreshing destinations you can go to in the summer. Walk into an air-conditioned apartment. That always feels good. Going down like the refrigerator aisle in the supermarket, or maybe going into see a movie. It's nice and cool. Well, I got a new one for you. It's your Hello Tushy bidet. Folks, Hello Tushy bidets. It was such a revelation towards the end of, like, I think the lockdown and COVID. I can't remember exactly when it was. And I had a friend, she will go nameless, who had years ago, who had a bidet. And I'm like, what is this? This is insane. And then, oh my God, this is great. But I didn't want to spend the enormous amount of money on one of those like full on, bidets. And then Hello Tushy shows up. And it is super easy to install on your toilet. I mean, this is the thing about a Hello Tushy bidet. If you know how to change a toilet seat, you know how to put this on. It'll take you about 8 minutes. And it is the most logical way to clean your bum. If you get dirt on your hands, do you take a dry piece of paper and wipe it off? No. You take water. And that's what happens with a bidet. It sprays up into your bum. All you got to do, take a couple pieces of toilet paper, pat yourself dry, and you're done. There's no electrician needed, no plumbing needed. It'll take you 8 minutes to install. It cuts down your toilet paper by 80% or more. You save money. You save paper waste. And you're going to feel significantly better. Every Hello Tushy bidet attachment comes with a 60-day risk-free guarantee and a 12-month warranty. Has over 100,000 five-star reviews. You can see why millions of people already love Hello Tushy. Be a part of taking business the cleaner way. Go to hellotushy.com/majority. Use the promo code majority to get 10% off plus free shipping on your first bidet order. That's hellotushy.com/majority, 10% off. Check it out. Link in the podcast and YouTube description. Now, back to Emma.
Back.
We are back, and we are joined now by Stephen Bright, visiting lecturer in law at Yale Law School and lawyer who has represented people in death penalty cases for decades, and James Kwak, professor at the University of Connecticut Law School. Both are authors of The Fear of Too Much Justice, Race, Poverty, and the Persistence of Inequality in the Criminal Courts. Stephen and James, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, of course, Stephen, let's start with you. Your work in this space is exceptionally well known. You've been going to bat for prisoners on death row and in other desperate situations for over 40 years. Tell us a little bit about your career as a lawyer and how you got to this point of choosing to make this a central plank of your law career.
Well, in 1979, I was practicing law in Washington, D.C. I was a public defender. I'd like to think I was minding my own business. And then someone called me from Georgia and asked if I would take a capital case. And I sort of wondered why. In Georgia, I wasn't practicing there. It's death penalty. We didn't have the death penalty in Washington. I was told we'll take anybody we can get. That there were people being sentenced to death who were desperately in need of lawyers. And there were no provisions for providing lawyers. I was shocked by that. But I and George Kendall and Russ Cannon took that case, and starting then and from then on, I saw a lot of injustice, not only in death penalty cases, but a lot of other cases. Incredibly poor lawyers for people accused of crimes, blatant race discrimination, and all throughout the system. Very terrible imbalance of power, with prosecutors having all the power and very often the defense lawyers being totally ill-equipped to deal with the cases. And so one thing sort of led to another. In 1982, I went down to the Southern Center for Human Rights and stayed there for about 35 years, representing people in capital cases. And much of what I saw during that time is what is in the book that James and I have put together here.
And I mean, a lot of this is concentrated in the South. And I'm wondering, James, if you could speak to that in particular as well, because clearly, as your book talks about, there's a deep racism involved in capital punishment cases and in terms of just cases where people are locked up and warehoused without any real recourse. And often their sentences are more extreme than typical, if you don't mind shedding light on that connection.
Of course. I mean, so a lot of the inequalities of the criminal legal system in the country as a whole, and particularly in the South, are the result of the racism in America's history. A lot of the, things that we see, such as the enormous disparities in who gets the death penalty, what kinds of defendants, for what kinds of victims, those date back to the days of slavery, when the punishments for Black people and white people committing the same crimes were very different. The punishments for crimes committed against Black people and white people were very different. In many ways, the criminal legal system today can be seen as a mechanism to perpetuate racial injustice and racial oppression in this country. Now, that said, we certainly we can't absolve the North. Many of these problems are worse in the South, that is true, but many of them are nationwide. So, for example, the practice of preventing Black people from being on juries, that was essentially a nationwide problem. It's now worse in the South than in the North, but that was a nationwide issue. Discrimination of the application, racial discrimination of the application of the death penalty has been a national issue. Now, it is true that the death penalty is imposed more often in certain southern states, particularly Texas, Oklahoma, Virginia, until it was repealed about a few years ago, Alabama, Georgia, Florida. And that is often because of, and that is possible not only because of the history of racism, but also because whether or not to seek the death penalty, whether or not to follow through with it is largely up to individual prosecutors who are largely elected. So in some ways, that's a function of the politicization of the legal system in this country and the kinds of people who are elected to be district attorneys. And that can happen anywhere in the country. We have worse results in the South than elsewhere, but it's not just a regional problem.
It's prosecutorial power, as you say, but Stephen, as a someone who got your career started as a public defender, how much of it as well is the underfunding and deprioritization of a robust public defense structure?
Well, of course, that's the problem. And I'd add one little footnote to what James said about sort of the historical context here. Before the Civil War, the northern states like Michigan, Wisconsin, were repealing the death penalty. They were debating whether death penalty was a good idea or not. That debate was not going on in the South because the death penalty, when you have a slave population, you need the death penalty. The population's already, for all practical purpose, in prison. And what happened after the war was that Black people for a long time were lynched, of course, whenever there was certain kinds of crimes or certain fear that a crime had taken place. that got moved into the courthouse, and with very perfunctory trials where people would be assigned, if any lawyer at all, a very bad lawyer. The case would be tried very quickly before an all-male, all-white jury. Take the Scottsboro case in 1932 in Scottsboro, Alabama. It's sort of a classic case of that. But that continued. When I first started taking death penalty cases in 1979, 80, 81, I saw cases with lawyers who were just, it was hard to believe these people were a member of the bar, that they were a member of a legal profession. In Houston, for example, which sends so many people to death, far more than any other place. They've carried out 131 executions of people sentenced to death in Houston, far more than any other state except Texas itself. In 3 cases there, the defense lawyers slept during the trial. They were so uninterested in defending their clients.
Yes.
They didn't stay awake. Other places I saw in Georgia, defense lawyers refer to their clients with a racial slur. One case where the lawyer told the jury in closing argument, "Now look, I'm only defending this fellow because the judge appointed me and I have to represent him." In other words, he didn't want to alienate the jury by having them think he really was on the side of his client. Those are egregious examples, but there were a lot of others of people that just showed up, didn't do any investigation, didn't know any law, didn't put on any evidence. Of course, if you have a very aggressive prosecutor and a completely inept defense lawyer, that's a disaster in terms of justice. And that's why 11, 12 people were being sentenced to death every year in Harris County, Houston, more than many states were sentencing people to death at that time.
And Stephen, you won 4 cases in front of the Supreme Court, including one that involved this story that involves jury selection along racial lines of Timothy Foster. I'm wondering if you could speak about that, because that is another incredibly jarring example of the biases at play here.
Well, it's interesting. We learned in 2 different places about how prosecutors go about striking jurors, because sort of the curtain was pulled back. In Philadelphia, a prosecutor training other prosecutors said, now when there's a black person in the jury, you want to ask them a lot of questions so that later you can give a reason for striking them. Meanwhile, in Georgia, in Rome, Georgia, 2 prosecutors there were figuring out how to pick a jury, and they were basically, their main goal was to get rid of all the black people and try the case to an all-white jury. They never expected that their notes would ever become public, but we became involved in the case many years after the trial, and we filed an Open Records Act request for the file. And when we got it, lo and behold, they had forgotten to shred or burn or whatever they were going to do with the notes. And there it was, plain as day, that they were going to strike all the blacks. There was evidence that the reasons they gave for striking the blacks were not accurate. It was actually contradicted by information in the prosecutor's handwriting. He said he struck one black man because his church was adamantly opposed to the death penalty. There was a note in the file signed by the prosecutor. It said the church took no position on the death penalty. It left it up to the individual members. But I will say this about that case. Even after we presented that evidence, the Georgia courts were not the least bit disturbed by it. It was upheld by a trial judge in Georgia. It was upheld by the Georgia Supreme Court. And fortunately, the Supreme Court of the United States took the case, and every justice except Justice Thomas agreed that there had been race discrimination in picking the jury. It was just so blatant in that case.
Naturally, it's not a shock to hear the name Justice Thomas on that side of things. And when you talking about the Supreme Court here, that brings me really to the title of your book, James. I'm wondering if you could speak about that, how it comes from this 1987 case, McCleskey versus Kemp, the phrase, the fear of too much justice, and how that represents a troubling train of case law when it comes to the Supreme Court's approach to the topic of capital punishment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised to find that the Supreme Court pretty explicitly, well, or if you look at their behavior, pretty explicitly does not place justice at the top of their priority list. So as you said, the title of the book comes from the McCleskey case, a 1987 case, in which a black man had been sentenced to death. And he appealed, and the grounds for his appeal were that the death penalty was being imposed in a racially discriminatory manner in Georgia. So he hired, his defense team hired statisticians who studied essentially every murder that had taken place in Georgia over many years. And they found that you were much more likely to be sentenced to death if you killed a white person than a black person. You were more likely to be sentenced to death if you were a black person as opposed to a white person. And if you were a black person who killed a white person, you had the highest odds of being sentenced to death. And this evidence was presented to the Supreme Court. And in a very close case, it was 5-4. The Supreme Court upheld the death sentence. And in writing for the majority, Justice Powell said, essentially did not try to, the majority opinion did not attack the evidence, did not contest the evidence. What it said was that what you have to do is you have to prove, McCleskey has to prove that the prosecutor was discriminated against him because of his race in this case. It's not enough to look at the statistics. And he went on to say, you know, if we were to overturn the death penalty in this case, we might have to look at racial discrimination in other types of sentences. Or we might have to look exactly. Or we might have to look at other types of discrimination against other underrepresented groups, or even, God forbid, against women. And that would be going too far. And in dissent, one of the justices said, this betrays a fear of too much justice, which is, again, the Supreme Court should be, you know, if there's injustice elsewhere, the Supreme Court should try to root out that injustice, should not say, no, this is more than we can deal with. And so we chose that as the title of the book because we think it applies in a lot of other cases. So we've talked about death penalty cases, which are the highest stakes cases in the criminal legal system. Just to look at another example, so we talked earlier about the failure of federal, state, and local governments to adequately fund public defender systems. Many states do not have public defender systems at all. Those that do, they're often underfunded, and the public defenders are overworked, just do not have the resources to do their jobs effectively. And why is this? The Supreme Court said in the 1960s that if you're on trial and you face the potential loss of liberty, you have the right to a lawyer. And, you know, to make a long story short, the Supreme Court has simply not followed through on this promise. So what it means to have a lawyer, the Supreme Court has set a very low bar, which allows people, as Steve mentioned, to have lawyers who fall asleep and have those death sentences upheld, because the Supreme Court on the one hand, and then our local and state governments on the other hand, have not been willing to back up the right to counsel, even though it is enshrined in the Constitution. So this is another example of how I think everybody realizes why we have these injustices in the criminal legal system, and yet our courts and our governments are unwilling to do anything about it.
To continue on that thought, James, the statistic that you cite, I think it's towards the beginning of your book, about that there's been 185 people since 1973 who have been found not guilty to crimes for after they were sentenced to death. My kind of recollection is that some of those figures are considered to be obviously a little bit undercounted because that's just what's been proven. What does the research say about the numbers more broadly on that front?
Yeah, so it's very hard to know the total number of people who have been convicted, who have been wrongfully convicted. That's, as you mentioned, that's people who have been sentenced to death. I believe that the total number of exonerations, including all sorts of crimes, is in the tens of thousands. I believe it's over 20,000 at this point. And we know this is only a small fraction of the number of wrongful convictions, because these are, by and large, these are mainly cases in which there was DNA evidence, right? And DNA evidence is only available for certain kinds of crimes. It's often not preserved. One thing we mentioned briefly in the book is, you know, some police officers have been systematically destroying DNA evidence once people figured out that they might use it to prove their evidence. And when you look at these cases of wrongful convictions, and you look at So why was this person convicted? It's, mistaken eyewitness testimony. It's harsh interrogation procedures that get people to confess to crimes they didn't commit. It's jailhouse snitches who are basically being paid for their testimony by the prosecution in the form of reduced sentences. And these factors appear in many other cases in which there is no DNA evidence. So, one thing we say in the book is that the system is failing at its most fundamental responsibility, right, which is to convict the guilty and to acquit the innocent. And why is that? It's mainly two things that we've touched on already. One is the power of prosecutors, and the other is the failure to adequately fund defense attorneys. Because if you had a level playing field, many more of these cases would be investigated, many more would go to trial, and there would be many fewer wrongful convictions.
And that lack of level playing field flies in the face of what is supposedly a foundational principle of the American legal system, which is that you are innocent until proven guilty, except that the funding of the side that is supposed to prove your innocence is pales in comparison to the power and resources of the guilty side of things. And I know that's a bit reductive, but it does feel indicative of that larger dynamic. Stephen, I'll turn to you here. I mentioned at the start just how long you've been working in this field, over 40 years of representing people in these kinds of cases. You, even when you're unable to prove people's innocence, you will stick with them to the end. You've attended executions for some of your clients and been with them as they've died. Can you describe what that's like to see that state-sponsored brutality that we choose to engage in up close?
Well, ever since I've heard about the death penalty, it's always struck me as a remarkably primitive kind of punishment, and it is hard to believe that a society today still has it. But when you get to the point where somebody is tied down and put down, and you see the way the state deals with it, it's like a launching of a rocket at Cape Kennedy. All this ritual and this countdown and all these people involved to basically take a perfectly healthy person out of a cell in a prison and tie them down and put them to death. It's hard to believe that at this day and age we're still doing that. We don't do it a whole lot. I think that people who are selected for it are selected based on their poverty and their race and those sorts of factors, which make it all the worse.
The poverty element. Either of you can take this one. I am hoping you can flesh out just how we've spoken about the racial element, but the poverty as well for people who don't have the ability to fight back in the same way.
Yeah, so I think that, as we've mentioned, most people who are accused of a crime cannot afford a lawyer, and hence they're dependent on whatever lawyers assigned to them. If they're lucky, in certain jurisdictions, it can be a very capable public defender. Many places, again, it could be an appointed lawyer who does not want to be doing that at the moment. But poverty plays a factor in many ways. I'll just mention one more, which has gotten some attention in the past few years, which is the problem of cash bail. So in many places, if you're accused of a crime, pending trial, you're legally innocent until the trial. So pending trial, if you have, for many crimes, in many places, if you can come up with a certain amount of money, you're allowed to walk free. And otherwise, you have to wait in jail. And this is why, of the hundreds of thousands of people in jail in this country, a majority are legally innocent, right? They're awaiting trial. And this has a profound impact because, for the most obvious reasons, if you are in jail and a prosecutor offers you a plea bargain and says you can go home, you're extremely likely to take that deal because there's a good chance you're losing your job, you're losing contact with your family, you may be losing your house, and so on. And people who can afford bail and often can afford private attorneys can mount a much more effective defense. They're less likely to be convicted. They're less likely to be sentenced to time in jail or prison. And then, according to studies, years later, there are people who have more money and were able to not go to jail are more likely to have jobs, to have stable families, and so on. So the impact of poverty is really apparent, really at all stages in the criminal legal process.
And Stephen, is it more likely when someone is held and unable to come up with cash bail that perhaps their situation worsens as they continue to remain in prison? Just the psychological impact and how that might affect their relationship with the criminal justice system going forward?
Well, there's no question if you're out pending trial, your chances of being acquitted at trial is much greater, and your chance of being sentenced to probation as opposed to prison time is much greater.
Wow.
If you're in jail pending trial, you can't meet with your lawyer. The lawyer has to come to the jail. That's often a very cumbersome, time-consuming process, which the lawyer doesn't have a lot of time to spend. You can't, help find witnesses, do different things that have to be done. And of course, you lose your job, as James alluded to it. Maybe you lose your means of transportation. You can't pay your car. You can't keep it up because you're in jail. So it can be devastating, not only for the person accused, but for their family, because they're no longer able to support their family while they're in jail. And it definitely is going to affect the outcome of their case, both in terms of whether they're convicted at all, and if they are convicted, they're going to receive probably a more severe sentence.
Well, the book is called The Fear of Too Much Justice, Race, Poverty, and the Persistence of Inequality in the Criminal Courts. Stephen Bright, James Kwak, thank you both so much for your time today and for your work in this space. It's greatly appreciated. Thanks so much.
Thank you again for having us.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, guys, quick break. And when we come back, we are going to be talking to Katherine Stewart about the Claremont Institute. We are back, and we are joined now by Katherine Stewart, investigative journalist, author of the book The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, and who just wrote a new piece in the New Republic called The Claremont Institute, the Anti-Democracy Think Tank. Katherine, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Emily. It's great to be here.
For sure. So the Claremont Institute, people may be familiar with that name, but you describe it as not just a right-wing think tank, which I think people who are familiar with the name, that's probably what they would go to first, but an explicitly anti-democracy right-wing think tank. Let's just start there.
Sure, Emily. There are a couple of points I think I'd like to make about this. It's a think tank based in Claremont, California. Ron DeSantis opened a branch in Florida. So it's not just, I think a key point to keep in mind is it's not just some fringe think tank. It's really at the center of Trumpism. It's deeply connected with many of the thinkers, as it were, who are connected to Trump. And it's arguably even more connected to Ron DeSantis. It now effectively dominates the sort of higher education agenda for him that he's leading in Florida, in the state of Florida. And it's backing up the sort of GOP's anti-woke ideology, which seems to be the main message that they're pushing across the country. So we're not just talking about a bunch of irrelevant folks out in California. This is really people who in another Republican administration would have positions of power and actually, in fact, did during the Trump, some of them did during the Trump administration. I think a second point that we need to keep in mind is that they are up to their eyeballs in the January 6th stuff. John Eastman is on their board of directors. It's not just him. Ken Chesbrough is also connected to Claremont. And he's also another one of Trump's co-conspirators. And this isn't a coincidence. The overarching message that many of the folks at the Claremont Institute promote is that America is in an absolute point of crisis because of this sort of woke nonsense. They think that the election of any Democrat is basically an apocalyptic scenario. In fact, they famously, one of their leading contributors famously published an essay comparing the election of Hillary Clinton with, something like a nuclear attack on the United States. Something sort of.
I mean, a nuclear woke bomb, more like it, right?
Exactly. I mean, and therefore, many of their folks promote the idea that political violence is justified. Any measures are necessary in order to sort of defeat this apocalyptic threat to America. And they're very anti-democracy. Very many of their contributors are openly hostile to liberal democracy, to the principles of equality and pluralism that represent the best of the American promise.
It is a great wake-up call for people who want to think that January 6th was really just about Proud Boys and some crazies that really believed what Trump had to say, and not a really massive chunk of the Republican Party thought leader establishment, right? I mean, these are people that are intertwined, as you say, with the DeSantis administration in Florida, were a part of the Trump administration when he was in power, and will be again if, God forbid, a Republican gets elected in 2024 to the presidency. So if you could just talk a little bit about the institutional element of the anti-democracy and the attempt to deny the election.
Well, I think, a lot of Republicans, as you say, are really in denial about the actual crisis in their party. Something, seem to think it's just about Trump, a single bad actor. But in fact, at this point, the GOP is elevating voices and platforming people that are profoundly un-American, profoundly hostile to democracy in its current form, and in fact, justify the overthrow of liberal democracy. They dream of an America that has left democracy far behind, as do many of the folks in the Claremont Institute, which is enormously influential within the GOP. They're viciously anti-democratic. If you look at what the GOP is doing, they're committed to engineering and entrenching minority rule. They're depending on dark money alliances with ideological extremists. They can't sort of get their extremists in line. They're sort of empowering them. And they know they don't have a chance of winning elections without systematically targeting their base of voters with disinformation and conspiracies. And unfortunately, the GOP really shows signs of being every bit as toxic after Trump. This is a kind of movement that long preceded Trump and will outlast him, although he kind of gave it a lot of loft. He's sort of
right. Well, Sam, the host of the show, who's not here with us today, says that the Republican Party made the suit and Trump fit it just right, basically. And I think that that's a good way to view it. But let's talk a bit about the origins of the Claremont Institute, because obviously the intellectual history of it is key to understanding it today. If you could just take us through the foundation of it, up and some of the people and thought leaders who got it going.
Well, the Claremont Institute was founded in the late 1970s in Claremont, California, not affiliated with the university out there, but some of the folks who were affiliated with the university came together to found the Claremont Institute, including Henry Jaffa, who actually saw himself as a defender of the principles of Lincoln and democracy. And in its earlier iteration, it was actually a more sort of respectable, sort of conservative institution. But it's really changed over the last few years. After I published the piece in the New Republic, Henry Jaffa's son, Philip, reached out and he said that what they've done is replaced Lincoln with Jefferson Davis, and they've replaced George Washington with Vladimir Putin. It's really sort of transformed to become an institution that bears little resemblance to its origin. Now, there were always a diversity of voices published by the Claremont Institute's publications, the Claremont Review of Books, and the American Mind. But what we're seeing more and more is the elevation of these incredibly extreme voices. For instance, a fellow named Kevin Slack, who's a full professor professor at Hillsdale College. I can't recall offhand if he's a full professor or assistant professor, but they published a lengthy excerpt of his book in which he said that the GOP needed to make an alliance with, quote, the AR-15 crowd, and spoke about the justification for forming militia groups. And it's not too surprising if you look now at some of the folks who are circling around the Claremont Institute, such as Charles Haywood, who has been featured on their podcast and who has contributed to the.
Oh no, I feel we may have lost Katherine.
That he should become a warlord in the new sort of collapse of liberal democracy, and he's explicitly hailed the sort of idea of a so-called Red Caesar, which is an idea floated by Michael Anton and some of the other thinkers of the Claremont administration. And he's saying this is terrific, and he spoke about the sort of militia that he's gotten together. So these kinds of ideas are. I wouldn't say they're just peripheral in the Claremont Institute. They're actually actively platformed. And if you look at some of the folks that DeSantis has elevated in his administration, people like Scott Yenner, and you dig into what they say about things like women's rights, I mean, extraordinarily extreme, just, off the rails.
Yeah, we lost you for around 10 seconds, but we got a good amount of it. As always, the internet is not our friend sometimes. Right. So could you talk a bit more about some of the other thought leaders that you lay out in your piece, including someone named Charles Kessler, who feels he seems definitionally reactionary, that it's the progressive era of politics and the multiculturalism that led to the country's decline?
That's absolutely true. A lot of the folks like Charles Kessler do have this ideology that's very extreme. They think that that the principles of equality, women's equality, the idea that somehow there might be some professor of color at some university that very few people know about who's getting a promotion, and they see this as the greatest threat to American democracy. He published a book that's a sort of takeoff of Jaffa's book, and it really twists the core beliefs of Harry Jaffa and takes them off in a new direction to sort of blow up the idea of a society. Listen, there might be some critiques to be made of some of these diversity and inclusion programs, but what these folks don't do is offer any acknowledgement of the fact that these programs came into being because of systematic racism, institutional discrimination that has taken place over decades, and that there are sort of inequalities that might be built into the system that people are challenging. So
well, it seems like a fundamentally a critique of modernity, right? I mean, it's this backward facing, let's return to this time of status as an ideal. And I also was struck in your piece when you spoke about, I believe it was Jaffa, who again, was one of the originators here, how obsessed he was with Leo Strauss, as you talk about, but also philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, who he felt contained these absolute truths about the world, which I've long been critical on this show about returning to philosophical thought to abstract political realities and make it about these overarching concepts that can be applied without context. I think that right-wingers tend to do that quite a bit, to oversimplify a complicated world. And I'm curious what you think about that dogmatic approach to something like ancient philosophy, and how that contributes to the Claremont Institute's current intellectual path.
I think these folks are cosplaying at intellectual philosophy. I don't think it's rooted in a genuine open study and inquiry. I think it's the sort of, as I say, like the noise that they make. I think it's the noise they make when they want to justify their biases and their prejudices. When they're trying to justify the discrimination of women, or a sort of this idea that America is in the grip of an apocalyptic Biden regime or whatever, they'll sort of reach for Plato and Aristotle to sort of cover themselves in a certain kind of academic sanctimony. I don't think it's genuine. I don't think they're genuinely interested in the ancients. I think they're really interested, as you say, in justifying their current reactionary worldview, their prejudices, and they use the ancients. They're exploiting the ancients in order to do that. They exploit religion in order to do it as well.
That was what I was about to say, is it's almost a religious approach to ancient philosophy, which is hilarious.
I know. Well, here's something that I think is really creepy. If you look at and very Machiavellian, if you read their words, if you listen to what they say carefully, you can see that are not particularly religious. Many of them are probably atheists. I think very few of them are biblical literalists, or maybe a few of them pretend to be, or sort of take it on in this sort of faux sanctimonious way. But what they really believe, what they're really interested in is power. And they seem to really think that the rank and file are too stupid to manage themselves, and they need to give them this sort of biblical, literalist, traditionalist religion in order to keep them in mind, keep them in line. And meanwhile, they're, they really want to sort of appoint themselves as a new reactionary elite. It goes along with their attack of elites. They talk about how the academy is so terrible. Funny thing is, a lot of them are Ivy grads or graduates of schools like Berkeley or other very well credentialed academic institutions, and yet they spend it's like Ron DeSantis. They spend all this time bashing academic elites, and you get the sense that some of them might be just sort of hitting back on some of the fellow students that they didn't like or that made them uncomfortable with challenging ideas, but many of them are just cynically pursuing another path to power.
Absolutely. I mean, and the contempt for the popular will and for regular people is a through line that, as they rail against elites, I mean, that's the Trump administration a little bit, except maybe without some of the faux intellectualism that you describe. Another person you highlight as a foundational figure in the Claremont Institute is Carl Schmitt, who's essentially just basically a Nazi. So if you don't mind speaking about some of his views.
Sure, he's not a foundational figure in the Claremont Institute. He's a philosopher, political philosopher that many of them have drawn upon, including...
Sorry about that, yes.
No, that's quite all right. Leo Strauss, who they revere, who had very nice words to say about Carl Schmitt. But Carl Schmitt, look, he wasn't just a Nazi. He was actually trying to become a leader, a sort of philosophical leader in the Nazi regime. He, like Charles Kessler, was really upset about liberalism. He, like Strauss, actually was very upset and unhappy with the Weimar Republic, which he saw unforgivably soft. And, it's almost like they thought the idea that you need sort of more strong order in order to keep people in line, something that sort of, Kessler appears to believe. And it's really a kind of reaction to the principles of equality and pluralism and true intellectual inquiry. So, but he's been cited affirmatively by many folks who are affiliated or have links to Claremont, and his books have been, one of his books certainly was affirmatively reviewed in the Claremont Institute, and sort of the proximity shows that this is a think tank that has a high tolerance for fascist nuts, really does. If you look at some of the other people that it elevates, I'm thinking specifically about folks with these pseudonyms like Raw Egg Nationalist and another guy named Bronze Age Pervert. I mean, man, you got to look these guys up. It's like a lot of the stuff they say I wouldn't even repeat.
Well,
Tucker,
that's the Tucker guy, right?
The Raw Egg Nationalist guy.
Yes, and their fixation. You write about this too, with manliness and being a man.
Raw Egg Nationalist says maybe men and women shouldn't work in the same spaces. I mean, this is Taliban level thinking,
I mean, it's Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is the other, another faux intellectual. Although thankfully, I think people are starting to realize he's a nut job. Like that. Can you talk about that connection between this anti-democracy, this anti-pluralism, kind of ultra-conservative thought bubble, and that attempt to replicate or reify certain concepts of masculinity, and how that connects to their, nationalism, their white vision of the world as well?
You're also seeing this, I have to say, point out in the religious right, where there's like this crisis of masculinity, and there are people within that world in the sort of Christian nationalist movement talking about the revival of household voting. I'm thinking specifically of Abby Johnson, but I've heard it from some other folks. That's really a way of taking away the right to vote for women, because the idea is that the head of household, who is necessarily going to be a man because of their ideology of the family and gender, is the only one who gets to vote in that household. I mean, if you look at the crisis within the Southern Baptist Convention over issues around ordination of women, or even allowing women to have a voice, or the ideology that says that men should dominate their families, there's just I think a real reaction among certain segments of society to women's equality. Just as there is a reaction to the idea that of pluralism and diversity and ethnic diversity, racial diversity in our country. If you look at efforts to systematically downgrade or deny the vote in communities of color, if you look at race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression, it's really a reaction among a certain segment of society that thinks that it's really white men should dominate over everyone else. I spoke to a couple of folks when I was writing that piece for the Claremont Institute, and one of the folks they spoke to is Bill Crystal. He said they don't want to just take away abortion; they want to take away equal pay for women. They want to take away equality for women in the workforce. They want to, of course, they're super want to get rid of marriage equality and he said some of them probably even want to get rid of, divorce laws, that liberalize divorce laws and really take us back.
No fault divorce. Yes.
Exactly.
Stephen Crowder's very upset about that one.
But if you look at, the folks that Bronze Age Pervert, Raw Egg Nationalists, they don't just it's not just some random piece that they publish from these guys. They really, have platformed them in certainly a right nationalist in a major way, who says that men and women shouldn't work in the same space. And he said perhaps there are uses for inequality. He says in his very, he's got this sort of English accent. He says, perhaps there are uses for inequality. Maybe men and women shouldn't work together in the same space. I mean, this is Taliban level stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I mentioned Peterson earlier. He took umbrage with our coverage of his clip where he said maybe women would be better protected from rape if there were property laws, just as a thought experiment, if they were still property for men. Again, this is this reactionary, let's return to a time when there was less liberation and these people were still the folks with their fingers on the levers of power. I'm curious about your take on this concept of manliness as also connected to biological determinism in the way that they view how society should be structured, both in the inherent differences between men and women, but then when you branch out after that, it's not too much to make a case about trans people, Black people, non-white people, and then we're off to the races with essentially, very, very dangerous territory on that front.
Well, they're talking about, the sort of state control of gender order is really what they're talking about. But the irony is that, this is a movement that just kind of, appears to want to blow democracy up. I mean, John Eastman, who is co-conspirator too, and his intellectual home is the Claremont Institute, he, has basically said that any means necessary is justified in order to, to save America from the threat of liberal democracy, free and fair elections, which he knew Donald Trump lost the election and he did it anyway, and he said so. So his case is is like incredibly strong. And what they're talking about is a kind of chaos. And I don't have it in front of me, but in some of the testimony, he spoke about how, this is what the Insurrection Act is for.
Yes.
So they're really talking about promoting chaos, even as they sort of defend their own reactionary ideas about gender and race, and think that we should bring in the force of law. And I just want to point out that this is really not, again, like some fringe thing, and it's not limited to Trump. I was at I was at Road to Majority, and I was also at the last Moms for Liberty conference. They were both took place a couple months ago. And I can't remember at which event Ron DeSantis said this. He spoke at both of them, but he said it is time for us to impose our will on them, meaning anyone to the left of him, right? So, they're talking about doing this by force. It's interesting. The right used to talk so much about free speech, and we just want to have our voices heard in the noisy form of American democracy, and we want to talk about free and fair elections. And now they're really explicitly embracing an authoritarian ideology and talking about using the force of law to impose their will on others and to take over elections whose consequences they don't like.
I know I'm keeping you a little bit over, but I just have one more question for you, if that's okay. You towards the end of your piece, you write about Chris Rufo, and then I know you just mentioned Ron DeSantis, because Rufo is very involved, as is someone else who you write about, and I'm blanking on, in this Hillsdale collegeification of the new school in Florida.
Scott Yenner. Yeah, Scott Yenner.
Scott Yenner. Talk a bit about how, because that is very much the Claremont Institute project in practice.
Well, if you look at what they're doing, so Chris Rufo is all about this sort of reactionary nonsense. He's, as you know, the architect of the anti-CRT hysteria. There's that famous tweet where he says, I don't have it in front of me, we're going to, every time people hear the word CRT, they're going to attach things to it that they don't like, and we're going to basically delink it from what it really means and sort of make it be a catch-all for stuff that that people don't like. And so what they're doing is basically recruiting at New College. They fired a bunch of professors. They took over the board. They're trying to remake it as a conservative institution, almost in the Hillsdale model. And Scott Yenner is another explicitly anti-woman, very deeply misogynist individual who has said that there needs to be government intervention against in programs, in university programs that have more women enrolled than men, including education and nursing. I mean, they're really trying to, they want affirmative action for conservative men. It's really what they want, and conservative folks, but especially conservative men. And they're trying to remake New College in this way. They want to do that as a model for what they would do at other state universities around the country.
Well, it's a really great piece. I would encourage everybody to check it out, as well as Katherine's other work, including the book, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Thanks so much for your time today, Katherine. Really appreciate it. We'll put a link to the piece in the description.
Thanks for having me.
For sure. All right, guys, with that, we're going to wrap up the first hour of this program, head into the fun half, where the number is 646-257-3920. It's so clear how like all of these things begin to connect. And I keep using the word reactionary because I think it's helpful to understand. It's about reacting and returning to a time before these this progress. And the only way you do that is through taking it by force, because white men are not 51% of the population in this country. We do live in a multicultural society, and it's helpful, I think, to see a good amount of the Republican intellectual right and the Trump foot soldiers as well as a part of that same anti-democracy movement. That is what the conservative movement is, and it's not just in this country. I mean, in her piece, she speaks about how at one of the conferences she was at, the Viktor Orban affiliated Danube Institute was there, and they're very much involved in that project. Orban, and when she said something about state control of gender orders, Orban was trying to implement this child care or child tax, basically, policy that would give huge breaks for when women would stay in the home in heteronormative relationships and have children, but none for homosexual relationships. They're trying to impose state power to force the world into their, the square hole, and the world is the round peg. So that's conservatism.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is like these sort of think tanks have existed, for the conservative movement. Rick Perlstein mentions it in, I believe, Reaganland, that goes into, I don't know if it's Young Americans for Liberty or another sort of young conservative
John
group.
Birch Society is another
Right,
example.
exactly. And yeah, that's in the very first book by Perlstein. And it's the Claremont stuff is interesting to me, though, because that was when they had the popular sort of energy behind them. Like the country was, and the electorate was just going extremely fascist, basically. Yeah. If it wasn't for Nixon like blowing up in corruption, there probably wouldn't have been a Democrat at all that entire period. But the Claremont stuff is interesting because it feels a little bit detached from actual people. Like I think it's easy. I think it's easier for us to convey how the freakishness of these people to their everyday person than it was maybe to convey the freakishness of like coke-backed stuff in the 80s to people. Just because I think the electorate's different than it was then, and it just seems like they're pissing into the wind with some of the extreme anti-modernity stuff that they're going after.
I'm hopeful, and I agree with that assessment. But Matt, what happened on Left Reckoning last night?
Oh yeah, Left Reckoning last night. We had Branko Marcetic on the program to talk about his article in Jacobin, which is very controversial. This is the type of contrarianism that I'm after, which is the long list of the accomplishments by the squad. We get into, I mean, basically to summarize, I think people that are maybe too precious about voting. And I think there's room to be precious about the label socialist when it comes to the squad on certain things. But when you actually put up their record relative to any sort of replacement level politician, it's clear. And most importantly, as Branko points out, when you actually reach out to, say, unions or rights groups lobbying the government, just for instance, have them.
Why would you do that if you have a hot take on the squad?
Say you wanted, say one of your issues was you wanted statements about Assange or something like that. Well, the groups that do that sort of civil rights stuff say actually it's helpful to have these people in, even AOC, if you can believe it. So I think for good reasons we can get a little bit negative about certain things like the rail vote and other stuff, but I think Branko's piece which is long and well reported, is a good corrective for what to maybe expect from a progressive politician. And as far as progressive politician goes, the squad's good.
Yeah, not to be, too much of a girl here, but there is an element in our culture where we love to build up women, whether they're attractive or not. I mean, in the case of AOC,
it has something to do with
and
it,
then
yeah.
tear them down. Look at the history of any pop star. And I'm not saying she's a pop star, she's a politician, but it's a public figure situation. And that's a very, very common trope.
Yeah, and I think that explains why she gets a lot more flack than maybe a Greg Casar does. I mean, maybe we'll see as that will level over the course of time. And I also think Casar, his was a thirst strike, that sort of stuff is good too. So I think while these people and they aren't accountable to a socialist organization, I think it's more accurate to call them progressive politicians and socialists. But as far as progressive politicians go, I think, look, if it'd be nicer if we had just all the people that think, oh, they fall short in this or that. If we could get
propose alternatives,
the politicians that you're imagining in your head elected, because actually then the squad would be a lot better too, because they'd have something anchoring them to their left. So I think Branko's opinion on it is correct.
I am looking forward to listening to that. Everyone become a member at patreon.com/leftreckoning. For ESVN, we spoke more about the insane Michael Orr blindside story over there on youtube.com/ESVN show. Another insane story of one of the leaders of the Spanish football kind of federation there on camera, just unwantedly sexually assaulting one of the Spanish players after they won the Women's World Cup. And we took some calls, also gave some preseason vibe checks, stock up, stock down, that kind of stuff for the NFL. As my favorite,
say bet on the Timberwolves.
No, well, I mean that's what Matt's doing now. I mean, maybe you'll download your first DraftKings.
Opening a new credit card.
Your first free bet. They give you one free bet to get you hooked, and maybe that'll be you.
Can I make it $10,000?
Immediately, just hooked on it. YouTube.com/ESVN show, or you can listen to us on podcasts and all that good stuff. All right, guys, gonna head into the fun half. We'll take some calls and read some IMs. The number is 646-257-3920. See you there.
You are in for it. All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half. Oh, no. Oh, no.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back, boy is back, and the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back, boy is back, and the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman!
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ.
Yeah, or a couple of them, just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males.
Psych. Fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100.